Since its acquisition in 2007, Monolith Soft has become one of Nintendo's most prolific development partners, thanks to both its assistance on first party projects and, perhaps more importantly, its work on Xenoblade Chronicles. This large scale RPG series has become one of Nintendo's key pillars in the RPG space, and for good reason. Its robust technical underpinnings, gorgeous vistas, and strong storytelling all work in tandem to create something unforgettable. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is no exception. This is a brand new installment boasting a fresh cast of characters, enhanced technology, and an outstanding soundtrack to match. It's a game built on the experience the team has acquired since its inception, and it shows. So for this video, I'd like to explore the visuals and technology of Xenoblade Chronicles 3 while answering some key questions along the way. How does it improve on prior games? Have they conquered the image quality woes exhibited in prior installments? And how does it run? Let's dig in and find out. It begins with the bombastic introduction sequence reminiscent of the original game on Wii. Two sides waging war in an unfamiliar yet immediately captivating world sets the stage. As the camera pans across the battlefield, the game seamlessly leaps from pre-rendered full-motion video to real-time graphics, much like the famous sequence in Lost Odyssey on Xbox 360, before dropping you into your very first battle. Welcome to Xenoblade Chronicles 3, the latest entry in Monolith's long-running series. And from the outset, it feels different. The tone is more serious, shadowy figures emerge channeling Square's Xenogears, and everything just feels sharper and a little different. While it builds upon their prior works for sure, there are some noticeable changes that I really appreciate, and many of them are immediately evident. From image quality to character rendering and world composition, there's a lot to discuss here. The headlining feature this time around, at least from the perspective of Digital Foundry, centers on image quality. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is a great looking game, but suffers from one major limitation which I highlighted in my original video: low resolution rendering, especially noticeable in portable mode. In this case, it regularly dips as low as 360p, which, when combined with a sharpening filter, produces a rather noisy yet blurry image. Xenoblade 3, however, represents a colossal leap forward in that respect. Monolith has improved the overall visual quality, but also has boosted image quality. So you might be wondering, how have they achieved this? Well, without knowing the exact technical details, I can only offer an educated guess on the matter, but testing suggests that we're looking at a temporal upsampling feature. What do I mean? Well, let's look at Xenoblade 2. This game uses a simple spatial upscaling technique. The resolution is dynamic, and most of the rendering tasks are performed early in the rendering chain. This image is then resampled to the target output resolution, such as 1080p while docked, using this spatial upscale. No new pixels are added to the final result, it's just upscaled. With Xenoblade 3, the process is performed earlier in the rendering pipeline then, with prior frame data used to help build a more complete final image. As a result, on camera cuts, if you pause the action, you'll actually gain insight into the true pixel resolution, and this reveals that the most common resolution is actually just 540p. Yet if you look closely at the final output a few frames later, there is a perceptible increase in visual detail. It certainly doesn't look like 540p. This is the result of their new upsampling technique, and it looks great. There is one drawback though. With fast motion, visible breakup can still occur, revealing the lower resolution nature of the underlying image, but in most cases, image quality is perceptibly sharper than anything you'll see in Xenoblade Chronicles 2. More importantly, this holds true, perhaps even more so, in portable mode. Xenoblade 3 is one of the sharper high-end games we've seen running on the Switch in this mode, a far cry from the exceedingly blurry second game. Yes, the resolution slips to similarly low levels, but what you see by eye is noticeably sharper, which is what matters in the end. The inclusion of this technique does also raise some questions regarding the sequel to Breath of the Wild. As far as we know, Monolith Soft has provided engineering assistance to Nintendo for this game, and perhaps this explains why the most recent trailer offered such clean image quality, exceeding our expectations. They might be using a similar technique, and Xenoblade 3 is a hint at what it might deliver. That said, the solution to anti-aliasing is not without flaw. Look closely and you may spot a subtle warbling of the image during motion. But even still, it remains a vastly superior approach to anti-aliasing next to any prior Xenoblade game, especially for portable players. Of course, there's more to this sequel than just image quality, so for this next section, I'd like to discuss both character and world rendering. Xenoblade 3 aims to mimic an anime-style aesthetic, while retaining the depth inherent in three-dimensional rendering. While it's certainly nothing cutting edge, the eye, hair, and facial features are all presented using smart visual features, designed to achieve the desired look. So firstly, eye rendering. Looking head-on, the iris itself appears to be smoothly painted. The color contrasts against the glints of light drawn into the texture itself. It appears intentionally flat. Yet moments later, when Noah turns his head to the side, note how they mimic the curvature of the eye itself while maintaining this hand-painted appearance. It lends the eye's proper depth without sacrificing the intended effect. Other features such as eyelashes and eyebrows are also drawn in such a way as to remain visible through the strands of hair above, again much like a hand-drawn character portrait, and this hair also exhibits proper shadowing to increase the perception of depth. For my money, these are the best looking character models featured in a Xenoblade game to date. Character movement is another key part. In prior Xenoblade games, barring the Wii U entry at least, character proportions always struck me as slightly awkward. Shulk and Rex both exhibit what I call the Kingdom Hearts clown shoes condition. That is, their feet feel disproportionately larger than they should, resulting in a run cycle that feels slightly awkward and disconnected from the slope of the terrain. Okay, so it sounds strange, but hear me out. In Xenoblade 3, character proportions now feel more realistic, perhaps closer to Xenoblade Cross on Wii U, though with more appealing designs, I would argue. The simple act of running around the field just feels a lot better in this third game, and part of this ties into the addition of improved inverse kinematics calculations, essentially a technique which helps foot placement adhere more realistically to the terrain. The remastered version of Xenoblade has this to some extent, but Xenoblade 2 really doesn't seem to. Check out Rex's feet on the variable terrain and you can see that it doesn't shift or adhere properly to the ground itself. In Xenoblade 3, character foot placement is greatly improved, which helps improve their connection to the world itself. More importantly, the running animation now more closely matches the speed of movement of the character model itself. You see, in the first Xenoblade game, there was always this sense that Shulk was sort of gliding over the world, as if his footsteps didn't actually connect with the speed at which he was moving. That is no longer the case here, and it feels much better as a result. Of course, this is still a Xenoblade game at its heart, which means you can run and jump just about anywhere within the terrain itself, and sometimes that produces awkward results. Hopping down the side of a cliff and landing below never exactly looks elegant, I would say. But another important aspect to discuss is the cutscene animation, which is top-notch. Now, this was already true of Xenoblade 2, I would argue, but the scope and scale of the sequences in this game outshine anything Monolith has done in prior titles, especially compared to the first entry in the series. While the less cinematic dialogue sequences remain relatively simplistic, key story moments are depicted with these stylishly directed scenes that predominantly play out in real time. Cutscene duration and frequency also seems to have been increased compared to prior games, which is something to keep in mind. Happy days if you're here for the narrative, but if you just want to play the game, it should be noted that you can both skip the cutscenes and pause them at any time. Another note, per object motion blur remains in effect during these cutscenes, and is utilized during gameplay as well. Its application does seem to vary based on camera distance and velocity, and the effect is relatively low resolution, with visible speckling and pixelation, but despite these drawbacks, it does a great job at accentuating fast animation. Moving beyond the characters though, the environment rendering is also of high quality, but there are clear constraints. Firstly, it's evident that we're looking at the latest iteration of the engine that was first created for Xenoblade Cross on the Wii U. This game exhibits many of the same design choices we saw in that release, but there have been improvements made along the way, and it's a better looking game overall. So the world is split up into multiple regions divided by loading screens, but each region is large in scale, lending the game a seamless presentation. You can fast travel between areas you've already visited, and the game features a surprising amount of variety in its environments. Now, for the purpose of this video, I have limited the scope of the capture to the first 3 chapters, but even still, there's a lot of variety here, from grassy plains, scorching deserts, dank caverns, and so much more. If we work our way down through the world composition then, the first key element worth noting is the sky above, which combines a beautifully textured sky dome with a procedural cloud system that changes based on weather conditions. These clouds are rendered at a lower resolution, mind you, quarter resolution if I had to venture a guess, but the soft nature ensures that in most cases at least, the effect is convincing. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 also features a full time of day system, like prior entries, but as has been the case throughout the series, the shadows are completely static and thus do not adjust based on the sun position. This saves on performance, of course, but the world feels slightly less dynamic than other larger scale games. Of course, on the flip side, this approach helps avoid shadow artifacts that are also visible in many other games. Now, beyond the sky above, the world itself is beautifully depicted, with long view distances, sharp texture work, and great art direction, but it's clear that many of the same limitations remain in effect from the prior entries. Firstly, the Lod Pop. This is a key aspect in rendering any open world environment, really. It's simply unfeasible or even desirable to display all objects at full detail when they only occupy a few pixels at a distance. But the key here is that you need to smooth the transition between lower detail and higher detail LODs, and that's where Xenoblade 3 is slightly mixed. So by and large, the terrain does manage to look and feel solid, but you will spot things such as rock formations, trees, and fields of grass popping into view during exploration. Yet I still think they've done a better job at managing this compared to the last couple of games. It is slightly less jarring overall. For instance, in Xenoblade Definitive Edition, there's a stark line between where the foliage is drawn and where it is not. This line remains visible in Xenoblade 3, but the effect is more gradual in its implementation, with sparse foliage presented along the outer edge, smoothly integrating with the thicker fields near the player. Despite these criticisms, however, I feel the world is still a sight to behold. Monolith continues to excel in its very specific niche. The shape and scale of the environments laid out before the player, with the snarling rock formations and beautifully crafted walkways, all manage to impress. The team has truly mastered the art of creating large open environments that are gorgeous, yet able to run on lower powered gaming platforms such as the Switch, or even the Wii in the case of the original. These flaws would be less forgivable on a more powerful box, mind you, but given the limitations of this platform, I think they've done a remarkable job here as always. Now, how well it runs on the Switch, however, is another important consideration, and that brings us to our performance testing. So by default, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 aims to deliver a frame rate capped at 30 frames per second, much like prior entries. It features correct frame pacing, and appears consistent to the eye when operating at its peak. While playing the game, I found that performance varies based on the complexity of the environment and the size of the encounters. So what does that mean? Well, early on, the sparse lands you'll explore deliver a stable 30 frames per second with little issue. These areas are somewhat devoid of complex foliage and structures with a more limited view distance. They're still beautiful, but the simplicity keeps the frame rate high, even when returning with a larger party from later in the game. In these situations, I felt that performance was in line with expectations and it runs as smooth as you would expect given the platform. As I made progress in the game, certain other areas seem to incur a greater hit to the performance, which becomes most evident during combat. And this is where the points I mentioned earlier come into play. Essentially, with the larger number of visible party members participating in battle, combined with the environmental complexity of these areas, you end up with performance that is less stable. As you can see from the frame rate analysis graph, it falters in these scenarios. Whether this is an issue for you or not will depend on your tolerance for performance hiccups. This has minimal impact on the actual gameplay, it should be noted, given the nature of its menu and shortcut-driven design, but it can certainly be distracting for many users, so that's definitely something to keep in mind. For good measure then, this is an example of cutscene performance. Now in general, cutscenes do operate at or near the 30 frames per second target, with only very specific sequences causing noticeable dips in performance, so the playback here is generally quite good. Now most of the sequences are real time, but certain cutscenes are presented as pre-rendered video clips, and the video compression used here is pretty good. You can certainly see some macro blocking artifacts in certain areas of the screen, but by and large, it's better than you might expect and it holds up decently on a 65-inch OLED. Of course, in portable mode, the compression artifacts are virtually invisible, and all of the performance metrics I've already shared apply to this mode as well. So we've established that Xenoblade 3 is a step up from any prior entry in the series in terms of visual quality, but it does exhibit some performance hiccups. But that brings us to our next topic, which is sound. Audio is always kinda hit or miss on the Switch, with many games offering nothing more than 2.0 stereo output when docked, but I am happy to report that Xenoblade 3 does in fact support full 5.1 surround sound. And as an additional bonus, the game includes both English and Japanese spoken language options to suit various preferences. But it's the musical score that really seals the deal here, featuring a selection of musicians including the always delightful Yasunori Mitsuda. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 boasts a wide selection of tracks that really pull you into the world. Tracks like this. It's all rather evocative, but some of the more dramatic tracks are equally impressive. So yeah, between the presentation, the music, storytelling, and all of the gameplay refinements, Xenoblade 3 really managed to get its hooks into me, and it's well on its way to becoming one of my favorite entries in the series. The only real complaint I could level at it at this point is the prevalence of tutorials during the first dozen hours or so. It's not as continuous as Xenoblade 2, mind you, but I'm still not a fan of these constant tutorial prompts. At least the game's user interface is highly customizable with many options that you can enable or disable as you like. In fact, the menu system itself is another highlight worth mentioning. It looks great. So yeah, given everything we've discussed today, I feel pretty good about the game, and if you're a fan of the series, you should too. It's also likely the final Xenoblade game created for the original Switch hardware, at least as the primary target. If the series is to continue, and I certainly hope it does, perhaps we'll see what they can do on a next generation Switch. But until that day arrives, that's gonna do it for this video, so hopefully you enjoyed it, and if so, be sure to let us know. And we'll see you next time.